Heir to the Empire kickstarted the Star Wars expanded universe. It is by far, the community will tell you this a lot more often than I will, that it is the most influential work to come out of Star Wars novels. That statement is undeniable. You can sum these books up in one word, it is influence. And that's it. People will go around calling this trilogy a masterpiece. 10 out of 10. 5 stars. That this is the perfect trilogy, the best thing to come out of Legends, and will just throw around the word of this thing like they are spreading the gospel. I really think this is a terrible thing that the community has done. Not because these books are bad. These books don't come close to being bad, but they also don't come close to being masterpieces. The Empire Trilogy is, unfortunately, if I can sum up my critique in one word, it is uneventful. There are some really good scenes, there's some amazing scenes, there's some amazing moments, there's a lot of strengths. Overall, considering it's a trilogy that will take you over 1,000 pages, it is not the most eventful story you will ever see. It should be prefaced that this is my first time doing something like this. I've never made a review on a book, never made a review on really anything in video form, so this is very new to me. It's going to be very messy. This is actually my second time trying to record this as a whole. The first time was atrocious. Repeated myself so often. There was a lot of problems with the video. So this is my second time recording it, but I think if I can record this well enough that it's watchable, and then who knows, if I can stay consistent with this, keep making videos in a year's time, if I can look back on this and be embarrassed at all the issues with production on it, then I think that's a win. Even if I end up hating this video, by comparison to what I may develop on and improve on in terms of video editing, or even if I write a script for one of these in the future, that's still a win because I had to start somewhere. So it is going to be messy, and there's not really any other way around that. I'm not using a script for this video. The quality may be a little up and down. I do want to get into more kind of nerd content in general, but I won't delay anymore. The video is about reviewing these books, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start off with Heir to the Empire, the first book in this trilogy, the highest regarded book in this trilogy, and debatably the highest regarded book in Star Wars novels, full stop. I definitely think this is the weakest in the trilogy. I don't think this is nearly the standard that people had made it out to be, and I think there's a lot of problems with this book. So I think the easiest way to sum up my thoughts on this book, my problems with this book mainly, is that it doesn't have the excitement that the first installment of a big trilogy always should have. If I were to pull out an example, let's go with the most famous trilogy of all time, debatably, Lord of the Rings. The first installment of that trilogy has some incredible moments. The opening hour has some already really fun, emotional, evocative moments. And if we don't completely focus on the fact that that story is the hero's journey and that this is not, this is the post-hero's journey, it still doesn't really have anything exciting. It doesn't have anything reminiscent of the Balrog versus Gandalf. It doesn't have anything similar to Boromir's sacrifice. Even if we're to compare it to normal Star Wars trilogies, it doesn't have a Ben Kenobi sacrifice. It doesn't have the big Death Star explosion battle. It doesn't even have something reminiscent of a Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan versus Darth Maul. The most that this book has going for it in terms of memorable, eventful scenes is the final battle at the end, and even that doesn't really live up. Now, introduction-wise, this book introduces its original characters. It introduces the established cast really well. I definitely think the strongest of this book is the opening few chapters. You get some incredible scenes, a lot of which I'm going to mention and praise at the very end of the video when I have a spoiler section header, where I'll be talking about stuff more in depth spoiler-wise, rather than switching between spoiler and non-spoiler. But the opening has some really good scenes. It introduces its characters really well. It gives you a real feel for what these characters are going to do. And just overall, really strong work in terms of introducing characters, introducing the world, introducing the story. Introductions was this book's strongest thing. But it doesn't really do anything. It's very uneventful. Luke's journey in this book isn't even a journey. He goes between planets talking to people. He goes between planets, coincidentally meeting back up with Han and Leia, which makes no sense in a universe this big. And even so, a lot of those scenes just aren't interesting. The introductions prove Zahn is an amazing writer. He's a really good writer, but he just doesn't make you very engaged through this book. Especially considering that Thrawn would go on to go from an extra book villain to being one of the most important characters in canon. So it was, to say the least, a big letdown when I read this, and I kind of walked away from it very underwhelmed. Hell, even the ending of this book, after the okay final stretch, has a space battle at the end, which is all right. People really liked it. It seemed online, but I thought it was okay. The ending of this book is very like, again, the first installment in a trilogy usually concludes in a way where it makes the story stand on its own 2 feet, but also makes way for continuations. This book ended like the end of a scene. Not even like the end of a chapter, like the end of a scene. Even though it pretty much directly leads into the next book, it didn't leave me craving more like most trilogies usually would. People like this book because it's influential, because it kickstarted a lot of stuff in the expanded universe, which considerably raised my expectations of it to incredibly high, and I don't think the blame can be placed on me for that, because people speak of this as 5 stars. I see modern reviews all the time from either YouTube, Fable, Goodreads, anywhere. I will see people, Reddit especially, praise this book, give it a 5, say it holds up, say it's a masterpiece, say it's the best in this trilogy. And honestly, that last sentiment, that it's the best in this trilogy, left me the most underwhelmed at all. Because I thought, if this is the pinnacle of this trilogy, how boring are the other two going to be? How am I supposed to slog myself through another 2 500-page books when the first one didn't really leave me wanting anything more? It introduced stuff well, and I, at the time, expected to be really satisfied and still be interested in seeing where a lot of the plot lines and the character stories went. And some of them went really well, some of them went not so well, but yeah, this book didn't leave me wanting more like I really wanted, and the blame cannot be placed on me for my high expectations. Overall, I think I would give Heir to the Empire a 3.5 out of 5. I feel like I'm being pretty nice to it with that, but I don't think I can call this book average, not even just because of the influence, but just because there's a lot worse books out there than Heir to the Empire. And I do think it had its strengths, and I do think it built up well to some other stuff eventually. So you'd think that my expectations were lowered when I started this thing now. I've kind of seen what's going on now with these type of books from Heir to the Empire, and that my expectations would be a lot slimmer, and this is half true. Yes, now I kind of figured that it wouldn't be the 10 out of 10 5-star experience that I was really hoping for and really expecting, but I still had a lot of faith in Timothy Zahn because, like I said, from how he introduced a lot of the stuff in Heir to the Empire, and just from how strong a lot of aspects of the book could be, even if not fully taken advantage of, I still had a lot of faith that this book and the one afterwards were going to redeem it. The only thing that kind of tempered that was people saying that Heir to the Empire was the strongest in the trilogy, which I think is uh, not even in one aspect true. I don't think there's anything Heir to the Empire does better than the others 2 books, other than maybe the introduction, the opening chapters. Dark Force Rising had a lot of good going for it. A lot more than Heir to the Empire, anyway. It was a lot of stuff they built upon. There was a lot of new stuff they introduced, and it was just overall a much stronger book than Heir to the Empire was. Force Rising had a lot of scenes, particularly with Leia, that were really strong. Just Leia in general probably carried this book. I feel like Thrawn and Mara Jade were the strongest of Heir to the Empire, but in this book, Leia definitely outshined the rest of the cast. I think all of my favorite moments in this book, which was a lot more I could say than I could say for Heir, a lot of the memorable moments that I actually got from this book, books that kind of define the trilogy, I feel like a lot more than the previous installment, not to keep bringing it back up, were from Leia. World building was a lot better. I feel Mara Jade as well, amazing moments in this book. We finally got to see some moments that they were teasing in Heir. So overall, much stronger book than Heir to the Empire. I did still have problems though with getting immersed. I feel like even though Timothy Zahn shows that he was pretty good at world building, there was a lot of limitations he had. Obviously, at the time of release of these books, we hadn't seen too much of the Star Wars universe. There was no prequel trilogy. There was no other novels to fall back on. There was no games. There was just that original trilogy, which only has a handful of planets, really. So I'm guessing he had to be careful with what he could introduce and what he could go in detail on. So I don't want to attribute it to him too much, but it's not a flaw that I'm going to ignore in the books. I don't think he described stuff, scenery or just scenes in general weren't painted vividly in my mind enough. Now, while reading, I didn't have a blank image. I still always like to come up with my own image and my own idea of how a scene looks, how it's going down, all of that. And that still happened. And I really, really liked what was in my head, but I also still really like getting to feel immersed in the book, that the book is also painting that picture or painting over it or adding onto it and whatnot. And this book just didn't do that. The very final scene, there's a big battle. It's got some amazing moments from Leia, like I said, and it just didn't immerse me enough. I didn't really know how the scene was meant to look, and I feel like my image in my head is extremely different to this one. And I will not lie, even though it had some amazing scenes, it still wasn't very engaging. Still very uneventful book. There was still way too much scenes that even some scenes conceptually should have been really interesting, but I was kind of just turning the page, hoping that I'd get to a Mara Jade scene, get to a Thrawn scene, get to a Leia scene, instead of what particularly boring Lando scenes. I feel like Lando in this trilogy never had anything going for him. I feel like every scene he was in just completely flopped. I was bored. I was uninterested. I was wanting for it to end. I love Lando as a character, but I just wasn't that invested in his storylines and how they were written in a lot of these books. There was a character who had a part to play in Han's past, and Han's past isn't really explored in a lot of the visual medias. It's talked about, and obviously Disney had their own interpretation of things, but this figure from Han's past, even that wasn't too interesting to me. I wasn't that engaged with a lot of those scenes. Despite there being a lot of bigger moments that make up for it. Overall, I think I'd give Dark Force Rising a good 4 out of 5, and I feel like that's being a lot nicer to it than I really should be. I don't hold this book in that high a regard. In fact, who knows, in the future, maybe I'll reflect and lower it. Maybe I already have and I've just forgotten. But it is fluctuating between a 4 and a 3.5, but I feel like just because the peaks of this book, the good that this book did, really satisfied me, really filled the void that Heir didn't fill. And for that, I think I appreciated this book a lot more. So this is my second favorite in the trilogy. It's the one with the least flaws. Even though my favorite in the trilogy is The Last Command, it reaches higher highs, it sinks to lower lows. And for that reason, I can respect this as someone's favorite in this trilogy, unlike the previous installment. Then if we're going to get on to The Last Command, here's the thing. I had finished Dark Force Rising and I was feeling a little burnt out. I'd read probably almost 1,000 pages of this trilogy by now, and I kind of wanted to explore something new. And I didn't take a break, even though it would have been very understandable for me to take a break. First of all, I wanted to finish the trilogy, and I don't think that's that bad a thing. I had stuck with it to 2 books. I feel like giving up before the last one and then risking never going back to it was pretty bad. And then as well, if I took a break and I tried to come back to this, then I might have forgot a lot of things. And if I forgot a lot of things from the first 2, I would have wanted to reread them, which would have caused the exact same thing. I would have gotten bored, I would have got burnt out, and it would have been really bad. I decided I'm not going to take a break. I'm going to finish The Last Command. And I actually read this one the quickest. I think the highs that this book reaches way higher than the other 2. By the time we were going to the final location, the time where we're going to bring our heroes, our protagonists, to the final planet before we conclude things, it didn't feel like that. It felt like this was the second last. It felt like this was the one like hole we had to fill before we could walk across the field, before we could reach the final battle. And it wasn't. It wasn't that at all. So there's a certain character in this trilogy who works as a kind of secondary antagonistic force to Thrawn. Resolving his story in this book, as obviously it had to, even though it was resolved perfectly, conceptually, Zahn like proved what I kind of knew he had in him. That when it came to character work, he was an expert. The way he concluded Sabayoth, the way particularly he handled Mara Jade's arc, amazing. The way he handled Luke, even without having to rehash out what already happened in the original trilogy, really good. It was great. And you have about 100 pages left, and you're thinking, how are they going to conclude not just the secondary antagonist, not just the primary antagonist, but the entire trilogy in 100 pages? And they don't. I wouldn't be surprised if he realized the book was too long, or realized that he was just sick of it and wanted to end it. I haven't done my research on it to know, because then he concludes the story in the quickest way he can. And it just makes no sense to me. Now, admittedly, that is something that the community does agree on, that the ending does feel underwhelming. For someone who decided to take his time, for him to finally build up to and finally reach the pinnacle moments, the peaks of this trilogy, just to rush it makes no sense to me. Because how could you have been so short for time that you have to rush the ending, in like really rush the ending? You could have sacrificed hundreds of pages of this trilogy to flesh out the ending better, and he didn't. And that really makes me lose confidence in his writing. Really just turned me off wanting to read the other Thrawn trilogies next, even though I do own some of them. And that's the biggest shortcoming with this book. Even though Mara Jade, perfect. Sabayoth, almost perfect. He sacrifices Thrawn. And Thrawn was his main character in this. Thrawn was it's his trilogy. I'm going to talk more about Thrawn's conclusion in the spoiler section of the video, talk about why it doesn't work, talk about why I think it could have been done way better, even though conceptually it is good. I do think the strengths of this book mean that I'm also giving it the same rating as Dark Force Rising, and I do think that the fun I did have with this book carries it up anyway to the best in the trilogy. But I would give it fluctuating between a 3.5 and a 4 out of 5. I try to judge things based. Whenever I'm judging something, whenever I'm trying to give my thoughts on something, I don't like to give my thoughts on what could have been. I don't like to give my thoughts on what should have been. I prefer to review what we did get and why that's bad and good. But I do also enjoy mentioning what I would have done different. But it is just the easiest thing in the world for me to say in retrospect that it should have done this, should have done that, should have done this. But I mean, if I'm going to do that, then I kind of have to do it for everything. So even though there's such different directions that I really would have preferred he went in, I still will look at this book for what we did get. And what we did get was admittedly underwhelming, but also had a lot of strengths that I still appreciate the book for a lot. Execution-wise, I think it's unfortunately one of the weakest aspects of this trilogy. I think the story conceptually is really, really good. I feel like if this got an adaptation that made a lot of liberties to the story, it could be amazing. And who knows, maybe just some of the scenes that were less interesting, more uneventful, would translate a lot better to a visual form. And I do know that I think there are some fans who are working on an animation adaptation of Heir to the Empire. I would be interested in trying that. It was really boring for a lot, and I hate giving that critique because it doesn't tell you a lot about the work when you're trying to review it and you call it boring. Because for all you know, you could have just been bored while reading it. It doesn't say a lot about the story. But unfortunately, I don't have a better word, and I've used the word uneventful enough here. It is boring. There's a lot of just conversation that just loops on itself, that just could have been achieved in a very different way, could have been more engaging. Yeah, story, I'm going to give it a good 3.5 out of 5. It's good. It could have so easily been great, and I think that's the biggest problem with it. Character-wise, I think that's where this trilogy thrives. That even though, like I'll discuss more in the spoiler section, Last Command makes some unfortunate decisions in the direction it wants to take some characters and some storylines. I think characters is this trilogy's strong point. Like the original characters, the one we're familiar with, you know, your Luke, Han, Leia, Chewie, all of those characters, even Kenobi, even flashbacks to the Emperor, and even mentions of Darth Vader, all really well done. It's so believable and so consistent with what we're familiar with, and that's what I love. Even when I'm having different writers, when I'm switching between different mediums, still feels like the same story. I don't feel like I'm looking at a different universe just because it's a new format. The original trilogy already did character arcs for a lot of these people. Obviously, Leia would be a lot less developed than the others, but even so, she gets to really shine in this trilogy where Luke and Han didn't. Timothy Zahn clearly knew these films. There was only 3 films. There was no more expanded universe. There was no more Disney universe. There was nothing more for him to study up on other than those 3 films, and he still smashed it with making them feel familiar. Original characters, I actually think that's even stronger. Thrawn is amazing. The way they write that character, he's so interesting. They don't just decide to make him the intelligent guy who just knows better. They give reasons, they give philosophies, they give all these different reasons for why Thrawn is so intelligent, for why he believes the Empire failed. There's so many interesting things about this guy and how Thrawn himself just spins the narrative of the original trilogy that feels believable, makes sense, and just really fascinates you with his character. When you're reading this book, or at the very least when I was constantly hoping for him to appear again. Thrawn is handled exceptionally well in this, and even though I think he's actually overall, if you're judging him as a full character, taking in all of his writing flaws, I don't think he's actually a better character than the Disney interpretation. Hot take, but he is handled really well and fascinatingly. He's a much more of a minor character, but Captain Pelion, Pelion, however you pronounce it, also really good character. He's not there to just be stupid just so that Thrawn seems smart by comparison, which would have been a very easy thing to do. Well, I was pretty satisfied with how Sabayoth was handled. Definitely wasn't disappointed with. Out of all the antagonists, I was definitely the least disappointed with him. He was okay in Heir to the Empire. They didn't really do much with him. He was great in Dark Force Rising, and he was probably the best concluded character in The Last Command. Even though I definitely prefer Thrawn conceptually, unfortunately, I do actually think that overall, Sabayoth was unfortunately a better written character than Thrawn, as much as I hate to say that, just because of how they rushed Thrawn's conclusion. Dare I say, the strongest character in this trilogy is Luke Skywalker's evil wife, Mara Jade. One of Mara Jade's moments were really good. I really felt invested in this character, really wanted to know more. The Last Command is particularly. There was still a lot going on with this character that could have easily been resolved by now. I didn't know how they were going to take it, how they were going to resolve her character arc, which just kept getting better and better by each book. And they resolved it. That just made so much sense to like resolve her inner turmoil that I was so satisfied. And honestly, it almost overshadowed my disappointment with how Thrawn's character was handled, because at the very least, I got an amazing character in Mara Jade. I'm going to also mention Tim Card. He had some great scenes. Um, I know he's meant to be this badass, like bearded, badass smuggler, cool guy. I'm not gonna lie. I read him in the voice of I forget his name now, but this guy. That's the voice I read him in, and I'm not gonna lie. He was like so fucking stupid at times and goofy that it fit, um even if that's not how we're meant to view that character at all. That's the voice I read him in, and I'll fucking stand by that shit. Talon was a great character. I really liked his relationship with Mara, um, especially in the last in Dark Force Rising. And yeah, Talon was a great character. There's a lot of other originals who were okay, served their purpose really well, but yeah, character wise, I give it a 4 out of 5. I feel like Thrawn's conclusion is just so unforgivable that I can't raise my score on that. There's another character I want to talk about, but is another one I have to leave for the spoiler section. Pacing is this book's weak point. I actually love slow burn. I love slow pacing. I like when things take their time to flesh stuff out because it feels really rewarding when you make it to those big moments. The biggest part about the pacing that really irks me is that when you finally reach those big moments, Timothy Zahn rushes it. He goes too fast. I think it's unforgivable. I think 2 out of 5 is my thing for the pacing. I don't think it's unbearable. I feel like there's a lot worse books. That's why I'm not going to rate it lower. Even though I give this trilogy as a whole a lot of flack, I don't think I can sit here and call it terrible. I think there's significantly worse books out there, and I don't want to sit here and seem like someone who just hasn't read a bad book before. I know my ratings seem higher than how I'm speaking on it. If I didn't have high expectations, then I probably would have been praising it more. My overall rating of the trilogy is a 3.5. not the average of every score. Because if I was taking the average of every score, it would probably be a little bit lower. Or if I'm taking the average of just the books, it would be a 4, because that's what I gave these two. Because of how uneventful and uninteresting a lot of Heir to the Empire was, because of how they concluded The Last Command, and because I feel like I'm being really nice giving these two a 4, overall rating is a 3.5 as a trilogy. It's a good trilogy. It is not a great trilogy. And I feel like with this review, if I can convince anyone to lower their expectations for anyone who's hoping to get into and read this trilogy, I think that's a win. Not because I hate these books and think that people shouldn't hold them in high regard, but if I can lower expectations so that someone can experience this trilogy and enjoy it a lot more than I did because they don't have that preconceived notion that they're going to be a masterpiece, then I feel like that's a lot better for anyone who's going to read this book. So, spoiler territory. Let's go over the exact moments that I mean. So, Leia having her big speech to the Nogiri was a fucking treat to read. I loved that moment. It was amazing. And it was kind of the first time, I think, in the trilogy where I really felt excited. I really felt like everything I knew had kept track of. I really feel like sticking with the trilogy had paid off after I read that. That's the storyline I don't think was handled particularly well going into Last Command. When that storyline was contained in Dark Force Rising, it was very well done. One of the strongest things this trilogy did. I feel like they could have involved Rook. Rook was a big underwhelm of this trilogy. Probably the weakest original character that held importance. Rook is introduced well in Heir to the Empire that he's this creepy, powerful, tactical bodyguard who puts protecting Thrawn above everything. He doesn't do anything in Dark Force Rising. All he does is look intimidating around Thrawn, and that kind of fucked a lot of kind of the comparison to Rebels. Even though he's like a villain of the weak in Rebels, at least he tries to fight the characters in Rebels. In this trilogy, he doesn't do anything for the first two books. Rook is the one who kills Thrawn. I felt like Rook could have decided to take matters into his own hands. That because he's always on Thrawn's ship, Rook doesn't take holidays. He's protecting Thrawn all the time because they're a running, dying empire. He doesn't go off to the planet, or at least if he did, we didn't see it. So in Rook's mind, he should have thought that Leia manipulated his race. That should have infuriated him, and he should have tried to track down and assassinate Leia himself, and then he found out the truth. I feel like he should have been an inner conflicted character because he's so loyal to Thrawn and he served him for so long. So for him to feel that shakeup, that should have interested us. We should have been rooting for Rook to do that. Instead, Rook is part of that race, so you're kind of going confused. You're kind of thinking, well, does Rook even know? He hasn't been on the planet with the rest of the Nogiri, so how would he know? They don't have telepathy powers. I doubt they would have sent a message to him because, Rook's first and foremost loyalty seems to be to the Empire. So for Rook to just know, for him to just kill Thrawn, be like, that's for my people, and then leave, it felt so underwhelming. It felt like we didn't know Rook even knew. And I feel like it just really soured Thrawn's conclusion, especially since Thrawn doesn't even have the focus of the final act of this book. So for Thrawn to just die like that, for Zahn to finish Sabayat's conclusion and then be like, oh yeah, I have to finish Thrawn too. Let's just do it quickly. It felt so underwhelming. And it really soured Thrawn's character in this trilogy, and it really soured Rook, and it really soured the Nogiri storyline. It's obviously an amazing moment. Conceptually, it's great. Thrawn manipulated these people, and he was this smart guy, but he was so convinced of his own supremacy. He was so convinced that he was going to win, that he was smarter, that he'd already succeeded in manipulating them. He couldn't even conceive that Rook would betray him. And so it's so smart that Thrawn dies, realizes that because he never could imagine being betrayed, that's how he dies. So he says it was so artistically done. That's genius, but it just wasn't executed well enough, especially for someone who spends a very long time fleshing stuff out and building up to stuff. As for Mara Jade, when she came to Sabayat's planet, which already I feel like the dynamic between Sabayat and Luke was handled really well. I'm glad Luke didn't show up and immediately Sabayat was like, join me in the dark side. I liked that that Luke showed up and it was he felt like he was training again, that it was like another Yoda. That was really interesting. And so for Mara Jade to show up and ask for Luke's help to rescue Talon Card, that was so interesting. Like that was so fun. I really felt excited for Mara Jade. I felt like it was a really good moment for her and a big high point in her character arc through this trilogy. I forget his name now, but there was a senator. There was Leia exposing him was so well done. Dark Force Rising, I do feel like is start to finish the best book, even if my favorite is Last Command, just because it's got the higher peaks. Seeing as I didn't have a script for this video, there are of course things I forgot to mention. I won't go into detail on all the Essential Legends covers, but for Heir to the Empire trilogy specifically, I actually really like the covers. They're simple and people give them a lot of flack by comparison to the original covers, but I really don't agree with this. I really like the covers, probably even more so than the original covers, or at the very least, the first ever cover for Heir to the Empire. This book taught me a very valuable lesson that I'm not going to mention community reception going forward. That's not how I want to review things. I don't want that to be a factor anymore in my reviews, and I think this book was the one exception. Another thing is that I want to try to be a lot more careful with spoilers. This review was kind of mentioning events and trying to be vague about it, but in the future I'm going to try my best to be as spoilerless as possible before the dedicated header. So, as for what's next, again, first time I've been doing really anything like this. I do want to upload more videos on YouTube in this kind of style, this kind of form. Obviously, I hope to get a lot better at it in the future. But at the moment, the books that I've been reading very slowly, albeit I'm not even 100 pages into either of them, are these two, Game of Thrones and The Revenge of the Sith novelization, which has been, for something I haven't read much of, very well written. I have heard from many sources that it's the best written Star Wars book. Yeah, so far it really does live up to that name from what I've read. I would have loved to have read the deluxe edition, but at the end of the day, it is the same content within the book itself anyway. So yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. I'm gonna try to pick up the pace so that I can kind of make another one of these type of videos before long. I'm also listening to Hand of Thrawn as the audiobook. I'm gonna try to go through all of Timothy Zahn's Legends novels before I move on to the modern Thrawn trilogies, as he himself recommends you experience all of the books in release order. So you can find me on Fable. You can find me on Twitch, Linktree as well, and yeah. If you're ever interested in another one of these videos, you can click on my channel. Hopefully, I'll have a few more out before too long, and that's all from me.